everybody, it's Peter, and this is going to be a good one because not only is this one that you've asked for, it's one that I've personally wanted to do for a long time. So this is a 2024 Kawasaki Eliminator, happens to be the SE version, and we're going to compare it to the 2024 Vulcan S. Now that one is available in a cafe model, which has a similar kind of fairing as this. For the purposes of today, they're basically the same bikes other than the fairing, but we're going to go through the differences between these bikes, and I guarantee you we will cover stuff in this video that other videos aren't covering to try to give you a good perspective on what the practical differences are between these two. So when I talk about practical differences, we're going to show you a lot of things that the spec sheet doesn't show you. So do yourself a favor, have a glance at the Kawasaki website to see a couple of the differences, just so you know some of the things that I won't cover, but we're going to really make it practical and help you decide which one of these is best for you. So I'm filming here at Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals in Fredericton, New Brunswick. They are the #1 volume Kawasaki dealer in the country. They have a showroom here in January that is absolutely packed like it's midsummer. There's still some 23s here. All the 24s are coming in. And if you have any questions about any of the 24s, I will cover every single one of them on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and we'll go through that. And I got a friend of mine dancing in the background right there, which is why I'm laughing. We're gonna roll with it. A lot of fun people here. So make sure you subscribe. And again, if you wanna come see these bikes, Fredericton, New Brunswick, even in the middle of winter, all these bikes are here. So let's get going with this review. So let's give a little bit of brief context about both of these bikes. First of all, the Eliminator is all new for 2024. The Vulcan has been around for a while, but there's some key things I want to point out in that bike for the 2024 that now have some context with the Eliminator beside it. The big thing you need to know about both these bikes is they are cruisers, but this is a different type of cruiser. And to be fair, they're both different types of cruisers and different from each other. So there are some real practical things that are going to be drawing you towards one over the other. But both of these bikes are actually very sporty. This is considered a fairly light bike at about 498 pounds, certainly a light cruiser. Now it feels much lighter than that, almost 500 pounds, simply because of the low seat height. Cruisers sometimes can hide their weight better than something like an adventure bike or something like that. This one is almost 100 pounds less, you know, high 90s or 90 some odd pounds less than that one. So although there is an engine size difference, people were asking me about speed, and somebody just commented actually today on the previous video I did on the Eliminator and asked me about top speed. Now, I don't have top speed information, but in general, this bike is probably going to have a little bit more torque and passing power in those above highway speeds than this one, based on what I know of the engine this is based on and the engine that one is using, because I used to live with that engine for many, many, many years. I will never tell you top speed on this channel. You'll have to click away to another YouTube channel to find out top speeds of these, just simply because I'm not gonna take someone else's bike at top speed. But I will say both of these are gonna handle highway speeds fine, in part because they are so light, and they're also gonna be a lot more fun to drive than your typical cruiser because they are designed by Kawasaki to be a little bit sporty. What they don't have is something that the bigger Vulcans have in the Kawasaki lineup, which is the big V twin engine. That's going to give you a far more torquey engine and a more big cruiser feel in the way it feels, the way it vibrates kind of thing, and also the way it builds power. So you're going to rev these out a little bit more, similar to a standard bike from Kawasaki and a sport bike from Kawasaki, but not rev to the extreme like a super sport bike. So they are going to be faster. Even this 450 is going to be faster than many of the larger cruisers. And as an example, this one is just a hair under 50 horsepower, we think. They don't list it on Kawasaki's website, but Kawasaki's Vulcan 900, twice the engine size, also has in that 50-ish horsepower. It will just have more torque, but it's also significantly heavier. So it's an interesting way on the way they build power. We're going to talk about that in more detail, but now let's talk about some practical details. There's a different seating position on each of these, so I'm going to show you that right now, and that alone may help you decide between one and the other. So let's start here on the Eliminator. Now this one here is a little bit different cruiser style. You sit a lot more like a standard bike, and the real key difference when I say standard bike is the angle of my legs here. I personally like this feeling better. It feels more similar to the types of bikes that I ride. But if you're a typical cruiser rider, you generally have your feet a little bit more forward. So one thing to know here is with this Eliminator, you're in this more almost sporty riding position that's a more standard position. So it may have a little bit less legroom for a very tall person. For reference, I'm about 6 feet tall. You can see reaching the ground isn't an issue on either of these. You can be well shorter than me to do that. But if you are a 6'4" person and you're heavier, those two things may draw you more to the Vulcan S than something like this. And we can talk about weight a little bit later, but just for a general riding position, I find this very comfortable, very familiar. And if you're thinking of this as your first bike, this riding position is more similar to the Ninja lineup. It's more similar to the Z lineup. It's more similar to the Versus lineup, for instance, than other things. So you could get on this bike and do your thing and move to those bikes and feel more familiar. So that's this one. Let's go in the same shot now and look at the Vulcan S. Now the Vulcan S has a different fit system. So it's an ergo fit system. You can move the foot pegs a little bit forward and back, but it will never be the full mid position like we were in. It's always a little bit more foot forward. Now again, I think it's something like if you're 5'2" to 6'2", this bike is designed to be able to fit you right from the factory. So they can move the foot pegs a little bit, they can move the handlebars a little bit, you can get different seats higher and lower and that kind of thing to make it fit. But in general, a 6-footer is going to fit this like this. A little bit more of a cruiser laid back position here. So your legs are a little bit more forward. They seem to me to be a little bit higher off the ground that way. So it's a little less sporty position. You can't really tuck in this position the same way because the way your legs are, but again, a little bit more traditional cruiser position. So that alone may help you decide. For me, I like that because it's more similar to the types of bikes that I traditionally ride, but if you're a cruiser rider, you may find that that is not what is traditional to you, and this may be more of a preference. So riding position definitely matters. As far as sizing of a person, let's talk a little bit about that as we talk about some of the suspension. When I say this one's probably a little bit better for a little bit bigger or heavier person, we can get into that. But let's look into this piece here, some of the differences here before we go to the Eliminator, and we'll go around the bikes in general. So taking a look at the Vulcan S, again, this 2024 model, I can't remember the name of this paint color, but it is really cool in person. Sometimes it doesn't reproduce perfectly on camera, but I think it's pretty close from what I'm seeing, and it'll depend on the screen you're watching on. It just looks really sharp. Of course, there's black available as well. That's been the Vulcan color for quite a while, but this looks really sharp. So one of the things you're looking at here is a modified version of a frame that Kawasaki generally uses, a system that Kawasaki generally uses in a variety of bikes. Where this sort of started is in that Z650, Ninja 650 type lineup, and only the Versus, for 2024, only the Versus 650 and the Vulcan 650 still have this general setup. And what's interesting is the two bikes I mentioned. The Vulcan 650 is the shortest 650 twin bike, shortest from the ground, seat height anyways, the shortest seat height 650 twin that Kawasaki makes, and the Versus 650 is the tallest twin that they make, but they both have this shock out to the side. The Z650 and the Ninja 650, the Z650 RS, have moved this shock into the center, and that's all about handling. And when you think about a bike like this, you can get incremental gains for handling, packaging, that kind of thing, the system, the way it sets it up. But the incremental gains that you get from moving this are really only beneficial on a more higher performance motorcycle. So for instance, if I was to walk through a shopping mall with Usain Bolt, it would not matter that he has the advantage of geometry to his body over me. We could still walk the same speed. And the Vulcan S doesn't really gain, the Versus system doesn't really gain from having that really compact setting. So technically this is a little bit more of a dated platform, but you do have a single shock here. That's one thing to point out. It is preload adjustable. Let's look at the same view here on the Eliminator. So over on the Eliminator, you can see it's hard to get the exact same view. The bike kind of lengthens out compared to where the engine is, but you do have a shock over here, and this is a dual shock system. So variable spring rate, they are preload adjustable with tools kind of thing as well, but you have dual shocks, one on this side, one on the other side. Now, again, being a 450 bike, you're probably not carrying passengers across the country. So again, you're probably looking at this as more of an individual bike, but if you do carry passengers, it's capable of carrying that. So again, from a weight perspective, it can carry what you need to carry, but there is a different design. Anything with a dual shock is going to sacrifice some handling, which is why none of the sport bikes have it. But I would say, given the light weight of this bike and given the nature of this bike, this handling that it would sacrifice is probably more racetrack level handling than around the street. You're probably not going to notice a significant difference in handling purely because of the suspension, but if handling is your number one reason for buying a cruiser, in theory, the single shock could be better. In theory, or certainly mathematically, equation-wise, it would be better. But that is one difference between these two bikes. Now let's talk about the engines. So staying with the Eliminator here, it's a little confusing because in Canada they call the Eliminator 500. In other parts of the world I think it's the 400, 450. It depends on what you want to call it. The point is, this is essentially the Ninja 400 engine, but it is now a 450 in this Eliminator. So it's going to give you traditionally a little bit more torque just from a mathematical perspective. Now we think that also happens overall, tiny bit more horsepower, a little bit more torque. So what you have is an engine that is renowned in the Ninja 400 as being fully capable. When we talk about top speed, the Ninja 400, for instance, is seen on camera going 200-ish kilometers an hour, certainly well beyond highway speeds. So now that you've added a little bit of power to this, and especially the little bit of torque down low, you end up with an engine that is very peppy for what you've got here. So again, this is essentially the Ninja 400 engine that is now brought up to 450-ish cc instead of the 399, the 400 cc that's in the Ninja. So it's basically an improved engine on the Ninja 400, which makes it plenty powerful for a lighter weight bike. Moving over to the Vulcan S, you end up with their 650 engine. Now this 650 engine is used in every 650 Kawasaki road bike other than the KLR. So this is the 650 Twin. This is an engine that I've driven around and owned myself for many years in a Versus 650. They say they're tuned a little bit differently in something like a Ninja versus something like a Versus versus something like a Vulcan, but they're very, very, very similar on power, very similar on character. And I've described this engine in the past as the perfect street engine. It is plenty powerful enough to feel sporty. It gets good efficiency. It has a decent sound to it. It's not fantastic, but it's a decent sound to it. But it's just one of those well-performing, really reliable engines that makes riding exhilarating. It is a lot of fun. Now the difference between this and the 450 really comes down to this one does make more power, again in that 50-ish. Kawasaki doesn't rate their horsepower numbers, but the Eliminator is in the 50-ish horsepower range. This is in the high 60s horsepower range. So it's going to have more power, it's going to have more torque, but this is also a heavier bike. So there's a balance. It's not quite as much more power per weight as you might think. So although this one's a little bit more powerful, a little bit more torquey, and that's really where the difference is. This does feel more torquey, but both these engines are going to rev out. So let's talk about how these engines work. They're both liquid cooled, they're both 6-speed transmission. Let's talk about them. So when you talk about a typical cruiser, a typical big cruiser like these ones here, the Vaquero, the Vulcan, they have V-twin engines, and you can clearly see that big V. So these are larger engines that sort of rev slower. The two I'm talking about today are parallel twin engines, and just the design of them means that they have a little bit less torque, but they can also rev much higher. That's a key piece. Let's talk about why that makes a difference in how it feels to ride. So these two bikes with their parallel twin engines are going to allow you to rev to make power. That's more similar to every non-cruiser road bike that Kawasaki has. For a lot of people, that is perfectly fine. So if you are married to the feel of a traditional big cruiser, you're not going to get that with these. What you do get, though, is the look and more performance than much of those bigger cruisers. These are going to be more flickable side to side, more fun in turns, in my opinion, and according to many people, their opinion as well. But it's also going to give you that power through revving it. So the reality is that even though these engines are significantly smaller than those bigger cruisers, from a pure speed perspective, you're right in line even with the smaller 450cc and definitely with the Vulcan S. The Vulcan S is known to be quite a bit faster than many larger cruisers just because, again, the way it makes power to rev. So you won't be shifting all the time in these, but you will be shifting to get power, and you will be dropping a gear or two to make your passes. But when you do drop those gears, the gear or two to make a pass, you will have significant pickup and use that horsepower instead of the torque to make the passing maneuver. So we talked a lot about power. Let's briefly touch on braking power and suspension. So the front of both of these bikes is a traditional suspension setup. That's an right side up fork, not an upside down fork. It has a large disc here. You have ABS rings, and this one does have a little bit bigger brakes on the Vulcan than on the Eliminator. Let's just quickly take a look at that. So looking at the Eliminator, I should clarify by what I mean by bigger brakes. Technically, this is 1 centimeter bigger diameter on the Eliminator that we're looking at right now, but this is a little bit more beefy on the Vulcan. So your discs are a little bit bigger on the Eliminator, your calipers are a little bit bigger on the Vulcan, but basically for both of them, you have very good stopping power for what they are. Now, neither one has a dual disc, which you would find on heavier street bikes, but for the most part, the Kawasaki lineup, it's going to give you a single disc, and that's really all you need for the weight of these bikes and the type of riding that you're probably doing. So we talked about power, we talked about brakes, we talked about seating position, we talked about the overall chassis of each. Let's talk about the dash of each. So this is the Vulcan S. Now the Vulcan S dash to me looks a little bit dated only for the fact that several of the other 650 bikes have moved away from something similar to this. Now again, on a cruiser, I don't know that a dated dash matters so much, but a couple key things if you're looking at an older Vulcan versus the 2024 here. This has updated along the way from the original Vulcan S. So just want to clearly show, scoot down a little bit there, you do have a gear indicator here. You didn't always have a gear indicator, but you do have that. You have trip A, trip B, and your liters per 100 kilometers or kilometers per liter. So there's various ways to look at your fuel efficiency. There's also the instant and average in that fuel efficiency. You have your range or your distance to empty as well. And then you have your overall odometer. So there's quite a bit of information in here in this digital display. Of course, your speedometer's there. You can see your fuel gauge. When your fuel gauge is low, sometimes people ask this, it doesn't just drop bar by bar by bar. The last bar will start to flash when you're very low, and that's where this bike is at right now. And you can see the tachometer. Again, this bike can build power in the higher rev range, so it revs up to about 9,500 RPM, but you're gonna build a lot of your power between 4,000 and 8,000 RPM is really where the bulk of your power is gonna be on this bike, and that's where it's just kind of fun to make power. So again, if you're braking in this bike, a lot of time Kawasaki says keep below 4,000. Once you get through those break-in miles, you're gonna really find that power just above that 4,000, and that's where this bike kind of comes to life and really has that performance that you would want to see. So this is the traditional Vulcan S dash. The Eliminator is a big step up, and it may or may not be a thing for you. So let's take a look at that. Taking a look at the dash on the Eliminator, you can see something different, something Kawasaki's never done before with their cruisers. You have an entirely new dash that is different than their TFT displays. So what you gain in this dash is similar to what you get in Kawasaki's TFT displays in much of their 650 range and above. It's a different look. So you can see red line over here is around 11,000 RPM. So this bike can really rev out. You're going to be making a power again, that 4,500 and above, 4,000, 5,000 above RPM, but you don't have an issue to rev it up to 9,000, even 10,000. And again, red line to 11,000. So this bike can really rev, and that's where you're going to make your power. One of the key differences with this dash is it is a digital type dash all the way through, and you can see that little Bluetooth light flashing. This is capable of pairing with your Rideology app, and that's an app that we can show you maybe in a future time, but some of your TFT displays can pair this, and that can give you various functions, various trackability of things through an app. So that's one piece that's worth knowing. This is slightly more advanced. Now, some people prefer on a cruiser, especially a more traditional bike, they want their more traditional tach. You still have that on the Vulcan S. Here you have a very clearly laid out tachometer, but it is not a digital or not an analog dash. It is a digital dash. You still have a gear indicator, which is great for this class. There really isn't a lot of small cruisers like this that have such an advanced dash. And then you can cycle through the systems here as well. So you have trip A, trip B. Again, same thing, liters per 100 kilometers. So that's your instant fuel efficiency, then your average fuel efficiency, then your range. Average fuel efficiency you saw is terrible. That's because this bike has idled a tiny bit. Then your range again, then your odometer. So really the same type of information that you're going to get in the Vulcan S, but it's presented differently on this bike. And again, the different engine, different rev characteristic, higher red line on this bike. And of course, both bikes have a clock as well. I don't know if I mentioned that. Neutral lights up top, ABS light, engine light, and just the red sort of warning light if there's anything going on there as well. Moving back to the Vulcan S, I want to show you the grips and controls here because there's a couple of key things that are identical and there's a piece that's very different. So first of all, identical is there's a little trigger piece here that's going to flash your high beam. You got high beam, low beam, signal, cancel, horn, and you do have hazard lights, warning lights, four-way flashers, whatever you want to call them, right there as well, which I really appreciate, especially if you're a newer rider, you got to pull out your GPS every now and then, you want to park somewhere, figure out where you're going. It's nice to have those. So this piece here, everything I just showed you is identical on the Eliminator. We are going to show you one difference in a second, but what you'll do have a difference here is in the clutch. So let's just spin around and show you the difference and talk about a couple of key differences in the clutch. So taking a look at the clutch on the Vulcan S, like the Versus 650, even for 2024, this is not a slipper and assist clutch. Now, a slipper and assist clutch does a couple things for you. We're going to talk about it because the Eliminator does have that. So while this clutch lever is not heavy, simply because of what it is, a slipper and assist clutch can be a lighter clutch throw, and the Eliminator definitely has a lighter clutch throw. The other thing the assist clutch does, so the slipper and assist clutch does, it doesn't just become lighter on the Eliminator than something like this. It also allows you to be at a real rev differential. So if you're gearing down and you mess up your downshift and you just drop the clutch, on a bike like this, in theory, the rear wheel could skid if there's too much engine braking. On the Eliminator, it works to avoid that skid if you do the same thing, dropping from high revs, by allowing the clutch itself to slip just a tiny bit until the wheel gets grip. So slip and assist clutch is a performance thing brought in on performance bikes. That's also a great new rider thing. It's really not a huge deal on a bike like this. I think, you know, it's hard to do that if you have to be really riding aggressively. I've done it on my Versa 650 when it didn't have a slipper and assist clutch with cold tires where you get that little bit of slip, but it is a nice safety feature that the Eliminator has. It's not on the Vulcan, it's worth mentioning. What the Vulcan gains instead though is a different grip. So what you have, or different adjustable lever here. So what you have here is a set to the number 1. You can see it's at my first knuckle. If I bring it to number 5, there's 5 adjustments, it brings it into here. Now what that does is doesn't only help you fit different size hands, it also can adjust the feel of where the clutch lever grabs, and you have the same thing on the brake lever. So both levers on the Vulcan S are adjustable for your hand size and also can give you a little bit of a grab point difference, whereas the Eliminator does not have the adjustable levers. Let's just take a quick look at that to show you what they look like. So we'll put this, yeah, this is number 3 here. You can sort of see, you know, when my hand is in a comfortable position where it is, kind of between the 2 knuckles. Let's go look at the Eliminator. So same basic view on the Eliminator, you have the same pieces in here, but again here, it does kind of dip in here and it's very reachable, but wow, is it much, much, much lighter. So if you really want a super light clutch pull, the Eliminator is extremely light. I can pull it in with my pinky without a whole lot of difficulty. So there you go, a little bit closer than the number 3 setting on the Vulcan. So if you're small hands, you'll be fine here. Large hands, again, should be able to find that grip. But I mean, just really, really light clutch pull on the Eliminator. Taking a look at lighting on both these bikes, the Eliminator, when its engine's not running, the headlight does not run, but it is an incandescent bulb. So that is a traditional halogen type colored light. There is a little daytime running light-ish here when that bulb's not lit that you can kind of see when I have it in the on position like it is right now, but not running. Same thing with the signal lights, incandescent bulbs, not LEDs. Over on the Eliminator, you do have a full LED headlight, LED on the top, LED on the bottom for high or low beam and high beam there, as well as LED signal lights. So basically the Eliminator is full LEDs everywhere. The Vulcan S for 2024 only has an LED brake light tail light. So everything's incandescent except for the brake light tail light. On the Vulcan S and on the Eliminator, everything is LED. One of the things I really like about LED lights is that whiter light gives you a little bit, generally a little bit better spread, but it also is a little bit closer to daylight. So for me, that can help you identify things at night a little bit better because your eye is used to seeing things in daylight. So I always like to say it helps you tell the difference between a raccoon and a rock when you're riding with that bright white light. So again, little difference in the lighting there as well. So let's recap and then let's talk about, in my opinion, which bike is right for which person. So recapping, we know that the Vulcan S has not had 1,000 updates like some of the other 650s. For instance, the Z650, we're gonna look at the Z650 tomorrow. It does have a few extra things like a slipper and assist clutch, like traction control, those kinds of things brought in. It does have a frame where the center, suspension is through the center, so that's going to be a little bit more compact. There's a few little modernization things that have gone on the hyper sport or the more sport end of the 650 lineup. On this Vulcan S, a lot of those updates probably aren't going to matter as much. Traction control is a nice to have thing, which this doesn't have, neither does this one. However, they're not super, super powerful bikes. It's not like it's needed at this level. And if you're not driving in the rain, it's probably not needed at all. But what you have is a cruiser, and on cruisers, you often don't need some of those updates. What you have with this 650 is a bike that a lot of people have turned to because it's a lighter weight version of a cruiser that still has all the performance, and to be very blunt, more performance than many cruisers. This is basically known as a sport cruiser within the Kawasaki lineup. It is very nice in corners, but it still has a bit more of a traditional cruiser feel. And what I mean by cruiser feel, something went in my eye there, is the fork is sort of laid out a little bit more, so it's not quite as immediate steering as something like a Z650 or something like that. And your feel here, your seat is set up like that. Now this one does not have a passenger seat on the back. You can add that if you're going to be carrying a passenger, or if you're a significantly more heavy person than me. I do recommend the 650 engine. It just has a little bit more torquey feel. Like we said, we talked about top speed. Both of these are going to be able to go well beyond highway speeds, but that torquiness, that low down mid-range torque, this is going to have a little bit more of that. Now, what's interesting is I'm a huge fan of smaller displacement motorcycles because there's a lightweight feel to these bikes that makes them very, very nimble. And this is almost not a cruiser. To me, this makes it very difficult to look at something like a Z650 because, or Z450 for instance, something like that, because this gives you such a lightweight bike in a comfortable riding position. It is not a Ninja 400, but it has a slightly bigger engine than that Ninja 400, which is going to make up for the slightly extra weight in this bike. And really, it's probably going to have similar speed to what a Ninja 400 is going to have. A little bit more torquey, but again, not a torquey bike. That slipper and assist clutch is good for beginners, but it's also good for that aggressive riding. Because this runs to 11,000 RPM, you can ride it a little bit more aggressively. Now, the very first motorcycle I had was very similar riding position to this, and I went everywhere on it. The big thing with both of these cruisers is they are relatively lightweight motorcycles that are very, very comfortable, and that means you can do a lot of things. Because these are a little bit more sporty than some other cruisers, you can enjoy those country roads a little bit more. And then the biggest thing is these ones each have panels here, and they can be filled with accessories from Kawasaki or aftermarkets to take luggage racks, to take extra people, to take backrests, to take all those kinds of things. The real benefit to both of these bikes is they give you a pretty effective price point for performance of a bike that can do just about everything. So these are not adventure bikes, they can't go off-road, but if you're gonna go on-road, they can basically do everything. And I mean that in the sense that most people think of a fun athletic drive on the streets, it's just country roads. And really there's not an advantage of a super sport over these if you're gonna go relatively close to speed limits and you're gonna kind of curl through the streets. You're not dragging a knee on these. So these bikes both allow you to do anything you want. So which one's better for which rider? If you are an entry-level rider, this is a great, great bike to start at, in part because that seating position is so similar to a variety of other bikes. If you like the idea of a bike that you can take your bags with you, take your stuff with you, go anywhere, throw a windshield on, do whatever you want, but you want to keep the price in line, you want to keep technology up to date, this one's really, really good for that. This is not the cheapest cruiser out there, but I do think it generally offers you more power, more fun. It's not something you're necessarily going to outgrow, as people say, but it also, as a first bike, gives you an opportunity to really say, do I like driving this sporty, and will my next bike be more sporty? Do I like just the cruiser factor of this, and will my next bike be a cruiser? Do I even need to move to a more sporty bike or a more cruising, like cruiser style bike when I have this? So as a first bike, I think this is a really, really good option, and it gives you that technology that you're not gonna have to just sell to move on. It's not something that's so bare bones basic cruiser style that you're gonna wanna sell and move on. And it's cheaper to buy a little bit more expensive bike, entry-level bike, and keep it than it is to buy a cheap bike and sell it, and cheap bike and sell it, and cheap bike and sell it. The Vulcan S still has a place in the lineup. It does give you a little bit more torque. It is a little bit physically larger, and it is a little bit more cruiser in feel, certainly from a seating position. So I think there's a place for both. What's interesting to me is because they upsized this engine on the 450, I do think this is something that a lot of riders need to consider. Just as something that is a different type of ride for you. So let me know in the comments below. Is it Vulcan S for you? Is it Eliminator for you? Which one of these is your preference? And what questions do you have? If I haven't covered it, let me know in the comments below and we'll get back to you with all of the answers both on video and in the comments section. Thanks everybody for watching.